The evening was calm, and the grand hotel stood tall with shining lights across its windows. Guests in fine clothes moved through the wide entrance while golden lamps lit up the path. It was a night that promised elegance and importance, and everyone inside could sense that something unusual was about to happen. Inside the main hall, the floor was polished like a mirror. The chandeliers above glowed like stars, and rows of decorated tables filled the room. Men and women in smart suits and dresses sat waiting. They whispered softly to one another about the guest of honor. Some carried notebooks while others adjusted cameras and microphones. The whole place buzzed with expectation because tonight, Kareem the Saudi tycoon had come to speak. Kareem was not just wealthy, he was a symbol of power in business. People spoke of his deals across the world, of the towers he built, of the companies he owned, and of the influence he carried in every corner of trade. Many had traveled from far cities just to hear him, for his words could change markets and inspire leaders. Yet what made him truly different was his pride in his culture. He carried himself not as someone lost in wealth, but as someone rooted in tradition, and everyone knew that when he spoke it would be memorable. The crowd fell quiet as the doors opened and Kareem entered. His steps were slow but strong. His robe was white and clean, and a golden scarf rested on his shoulders. Behind him walked assistants and guards, yet none shone brighter than him. People rose from their chairs out of respect, and all eyes turned toward the man who seemed larger than the hall itself. He reached the center stage, adjusted the microphone, and lifted his gaze over the gathering. The sound of the hall faded until there was only silence. Then in a deep, steady voice, Kareem began to speak. But to everyone's surprise, he chose to speak in Arabic, his native tongue. His words rolled smoothly with strength and beauty, but the moment he began, confusion spread across the room. The audience looked at one another, brows furrowed, lips pressed together. A few leaned closer as if trying to catch meaning, but it was clear. Most of them did not understand. Whispers ran across the tables. Some tried to guess the meaning through his tone. Others hoped someone would translate. Yet no translator stood beside him. Kareem continued speaking with confidence, shaping each word with care, his eyes sharp and full of purpose. But the people below were trapped in silence. In one corner of the hall stood Musa, the janitor of the hotel, his uniform plain, his mop resting in a bucket of water, and his hands slightly wet from cleaning. He had been working quietly since the morning, unnoticed by most, for many guests saw him only as part of the background. Yet Musa carried within him a story of his own, a story that no one in that hall could have guessed. As Kareem spoke, Musa's head lifted, his eyes fixed on the tycoon, and unlike the others, he understood every word. Each sentence echoed inside him with clarity. The tycoon's Arabic was not just language to Musa. It was music, it was memory, it was connection. For Musa, though working as a janitor, had been raised with this language in his home. It had been the tongue of his parents and grandparents, a treasure passed through generations, and now in this grand hall it came alive again. Meanwhile, confusion deepened among the wealthy crowd. Some guests looked restless. A few checked their watches. One or two scribbled notes as if pretending to understand, but no one dared to speak up. The silence grew heavy, and Kareem kept speaking, his expression calm, yet his voice filled with meaning. He spoke of respect, of dignity, of the value of listening, and though the words were invisible to the crowd, Musa could feel them burning bright. The managers of the hotel stood at the back, nervous, whispering to one another about why no translator had been arranged. Their faces pale with worry that the event would turn into embarrassment. Reporters pressed their cameras lower, unsure what to write. For a story without meaning could not reach the readers, and yet the tycoon spoke on, unbothered by the puzzled faces before him. Musa's heart beat faster as he listened, for he realized that in this sea of confusion, he was the only one who understood. He felt a pull inside, a quiet voice telling him that perhaps it was his duty to respond. Yet he hesitated. After all, he was only a janitor. What place did he have among these leaders and scholars? What right did he have to step forward? But as he watched Kareem speak with such passion and saw the empty stares around him, the thought grew stronger. Maybe he had no choice. The hall seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. Guests coughed nervously. One man leaned over to another and whispered if they should leave. A woman fanned herself quietly while tapping her fingers on the table. The tension was clear. They were proud people unused to admitting ignorance, and none wished to reveal that they did not understand a single word. The silence around Kareem was beginning to look like disrespect, and still he spoke on, his voice rich and unbroken. Musa took a slow breath and looked down at his mop. The water rippled softly under the chandelier lights. He wiped his hands on his shirt, straightened his back, and for the first time since he had entered the hall that evening, he no longer felt invisible. He felt that the weight of the moment was pressing on him alone, and though fear touched his chest, another feeling stronger than fear rose inside him, a quiet courage that came not from wealth or power but from truth. At that moment, Kareem's words reached a high point. His voice carried like a call across the hall. His hand lifted as if drawing the people into his vision. His face glowed with the fire of conviction, but the eyes that met his were empty of understanding, until suddenly he noticed a pair of eyes at the back, steady eyes that did not look away. It was Musa, the janitor, watching him with focus and recognition, and in that instant Kareem knew someone understood. Musa's lips parted slightly. His chest rose, and though no sound came yet, the energy around him seemed to shift. He was no longer just a man with a mop. He was the bridge between the powerful speaker and the silent crowd, and though he had not yet spoken, the hall itself seemed to sense the coming of something different, something unexpected, something that would change the night forever. The golden lamps above flickered softly as if waiting. The chandeliers glowed with patience, the crowd restless and unsure, Kareem standing tall and unyielding, and Musa silent but ready. And with that, the first chapter of the night had been written, though its end was not yet seen. The stage was set, and all that remained was for the quiet janitor to decide if he would step forward or remain forever in the shadows. The hall was heavy with silence as Kareem continued to speak, his voice calm yet full of strength. But the crowd was drowning in their own helplessness. They sat stiff in their chairs, not willing to admit that they could not follow his words. Pride and fear kept them still. And in that moment, the distance between Kareem and the audience grew like a wide river, a river with no bridge, until the quiet presence of Musa began to shine in the background. Musa had listened long enough. His heart raced, yet his spirit told him that silence would only dishonor the truth he carried. He had grown up with Arabic spoken in his home. He had heard it from his father, who sang verses of wisdom while working in the fields. He had learned it from his mother, who whispered prayers in the soft language of their ancestors. And though life had placed him in the role of a janitor, it had not taken away the gift of language that lived within him. As Kareem's words rose like waves, the crowd seemed restless. Chairs creaked. Some guests fidgeted with their napkins. One reporter lowered his camera in frustration, and managers at the back whispered in panic about what could be done. Kareem's assistants looked unsure. They had never seen their leader stand before a crowd that gave nothing back. Their hands clutched papers that were useless now, because Kareem had chosen not to use the speech they had prepared. He had chosen his own heart over their script. Kareem noticed the whispers and the blank faces. Yet he did not change his tongue. He believed that the language of his soul was worth more than the applause of those who refused to understand. He kept speaking, his eyes scanning the hall. And then once more he saw Musa standing near the corner with his mop and bucket, still and watchful, his eyes alive with meaning. And in that instant Kareem knew that at least one man was with him. The thought gave Kareem strength. He slowed his words as if shaping them for that one listener. His hand moved with careful gestures. His tone grew warmer, as though he was not speaking to a hall full of strangers but to Musa alone. And Musa felt it, every word striking deep like the echo of old songs. His chest tightened, his breath grew heavy, and he could no longer stay still. For he knew the time had come to answer. With a steady breath, Musa placed his mop aside. The water in the bucket swayed gently. He wiped his hands against his shirt, and then began walking forward, each step slow but firm. The sound of his shoes tapping against the polished floor broke the silence like soft drums. Heads turned, eyes widened, whispers spread. People wondered why the janitor dared to walk into the center of the hall. Some frowned, others smirked, but no one stopped him. For something about his calm steps held authority. Kareem paused for a moment as Musa approached. His eyes followed the man who looked so ordinary, yet walked with such quiet dignity. The crowd leaned forward, curiosity growing. They had expected perhaps an assistant to translate, perhaps a manager to interrupt, but never the janitor, never the man who had been invisible just moments before, yet here he was, moving closer, carrying with him an air of certainty that no one else possessed. When Musa finally reached the center, he bowed his head slightly to Kareem, then turned toward the audience. His voice rose, smooth and steady, speaking in Arabic first, answering Kareem's last words with respect. Then he shifted into the common tongue so that everyone in the hall could understand, and the moment the words left his mouth, the silence shattered. For the janitor was not only fluent but graceful, his tone gentle yet commanding. his sentences simple yet filled with depth. And suddenly the river that had divided Kareem from the crowd found its bridge. Gasps filled the room as people realized what was happening. The wealthy leaders who had sat in proud silence now leaned forward like students before a teacher. Reporters lifted their pens again, their cameras clicking furiously. The managers who had been whispering in panic now stared with relief and shock, and Kareem himself stood with a soft smile forming, his eyes shining with approval. For he saw not a janitor but a man of knowledge who carried truth in his voice. Musa spoke slowly, translating Kareem's words with care, but he did more than translate. He carried the meaning. He gave life to the thoughts that Kareem had shared. He explained the wisdom in simple terms, so that even those who had never heard Arabic could feel the weight of its beauty. He turned sentences into stories. He painted images with his words, and the crowd listened in silence. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence of respect as Musa spoke. He began to feel a change within himself. The years of being overlooked, the years of cleaning floors while others walked past without noticing, all those years began to feel distant. For in that moment he was not hidden. He was not small. He was not a shadow. He was a voice, and the hall that had never cared for him now hung on every word he gave. The power of knowledge had lifted him from the corner to the center, and he stood firm as if he had always belonged there. The audience felt the shift too. They saw that wisdom can live in any man no matter his position. They saw that respect cannot be measured by clothes or money. And though many of them had looked at Musa earlier as just a worker, now they saw him as a guide. Their eyes softened, their hearts opened, and the pride that had sealed their lips began to melt away. They found themselves grateful for the janitor who had saved them from silence. Kareem listened with calm joy. His plan had worked, though none knew it yet. For deep inside he had spoken in Arabic not to confuse them, but to reveal something greater. He wanted to show them that wisdom could be found where they least expected it. He wanted them to learn humility, and by speaking in a language most did not know, he had created the space for the hidden voice of Musa to rise. And now watching Musa speak, he felt satisfaction like the blooming of a flower long planted. The hall that had once felt heavy now felt alive. Guests leaned forward, nodding as Musa explained. Some smiled in admiration. A few even clapped softly, though the speech was not yet done. The managers at the back wiped their foreheads in relief. Reporters scribbled as fast as they could, and Kareem stood tall yet calm. His eyes locked on Musa with respect, for he knew the night had shifted, and history was being written not by the wealthy but by the humble. Musa ended his words with grace. Lowering his voice into silence, the hall remained still for a long moment, as though no one wished to break the spell. Then a wave of applause rose, not the shallow applause given out of habit, but deep applause that came from the heart. The sound filled the grand hall, echoing against the golden walls and high chandeliers, and Musa stood quietly, not bowing, not seeking praise, simply standing with the same steady calm with which he had walked forward. The applause grew stronger. People stood from their chairs, some with tears in their eyes, others with hands lifted in respect. The hall that had once ignored Musa now honored him, and Kareem watched with a smile that carried pride, for the lesson had been planted deep. The wealthy had been silenced not by power but by wisdom, and the janitor who had once been invisible had shown them the value of humility and knowledge. But the story was not finished, for the night had more to reveal. Kareem knew this was only the beginning. Musa himself felt the stir of destiny within him, and the audience sensed that they had only witnessed the first spark of a greater fire. The hall, though filled with clapping hands, still carried the echo of quiet questions. What would happen next? What role would Musa now play? And how would this moment change the lives of everyone present? The applause slowly faded, yet the air inside the grand hall remained heavy with awe. It was no longer the same place it had been at the start of the evening. The guests who had once sat in stiff pride now looked softer, humbled and thoughtful. Kareem stood with calm dignity, his eyes still resting on Musa, and Musa stood quietly with his hands at his side. Not seeking the stage but holding his place with silent strength, the crowd waited, uncertain if the moment had ended or if something more was to come. Kareem raised his hand gently. The crowd grew silent at once. His gaze swept across the hall, and then he turned again toward Musa. His voice carried warmth as he spoke in Arabic, words filled with gratitude and respect. He thanked Musa for his courage, for his wisdom, and for showing the hall the value of humility. Though most could not understand the exact words, they could feel the meaning in his tone, his eyes, his gesture, and then once more Musa began to translate. Musa's voice was steady as he translated Kareem's message. He explained that Kareem had never intended to shame anyone. Instead, his purpose was to remind them of the power of listening, of respect, and of knowledge that may come from unexpected places. The hall listened closely. Every head turned toward Musa, and every word seemed to sink deeper into their hearts. The lesson was clear. They had been silenced not by wealth, not by force, but by truth. As Musa spoke, the crowd's eyes began to soften even more. Many felt regret that they had overlooked him earlier. Some whispered to one another about how strange it was that they had not known the janitor carried such wisdom. Others sat quietly lost in thought, remembering their own pride and how quickly it had been broken. The hall, which had once buzzed with empty chatter, now carried the weight of silence, a silence filled with meaning and change. After the applause and the speeches, the event moved forward, yet not in the way anyone had expected. Kareem invited Musa to sit beside him, shocking the managers and assistants, for never before had a janitor been seated in such a place of honor. The crowd murmured. Cameras flashed, and Musa himself hesitated for a moment, his hands trembling slightly, but Kareem insisted, guiding him with a gesture full of respect. And at last Musa sat beside the Tycoon, humble yet steady. A quiet storm in the middle of the Golden Hall. The audience leaned in to listen as Kareem began to share stories of his life. Musa translated each story, but again he did more than translate. He carried the spirit of the words, shaping them into lessons that touched the hearts of the listeners. He spoke of struggle, of patience, of how Kareem had risen not only through wealth but through faith and perseverance. And as Musa gave voice to these lessons, people felt them as if they were their own memories. Every guest in the hall now looked at Musa with new eyes, no longer seeing the plain uniform but the man behind it, no longer seeing the mop but the mind that had lived through experiences. The managers who had once whispered nervously now looked at him with admiration. Even the assistants who had thought themselves higher in status lowered their heads in respect, and Kareem sat with a smile, watching the transformation spread across the room. As the speeches continued, Musa felt something awaken within him. He had lived his life quietly, accepting the small corner he had been given, but tonight he saw a new light, a possibility that perhaps his voice could reach beyond the walls of the hotel. Perhaps his knowledge and his language were gifts meant for more than silent nights of cleaning floors. He did not yet know where this path would lead, but he could feel in his heart that his journey had just begun. The crowd too felt this shift. Some of them whispered about inviting Musa to future gatherings. Others thought about how his story could inspire their own people, and reporters scribbled quickly, knowing they had found not only a story about Kareem, but also about the janitor who had silenced a hall with wisdom. The energy inside the room had changed completely, from pride to humility, from silence to respect, from distance to connections. The night moved forward. Kareem asked Musa to share something of his own, not just translations, but his own thoughts. Musa hesitated for a moment, the eyes of the crowd pressing upon him like a heavy wave. But then he took a breath, lifted his head, and began to speak. His words were simple yet powerful. He spoke of dignity. He spoke of the value of kindness. He spoke of how greatness is not in titles or wealth, but in the heart that serves with honesty. And the hall listened as if a teacher stood before them. The chandeliers glowed warmly above as Musa's voice carried through the hall. The golden lamps reflected on the polished floor, and the people leaned closer, not wanting to miss a single word. His tone was not sharp, not proud, but soft, steady, like water flowing over stones. Clear and calming, yet filled with strength. And though he did not raise his voice, the silence of the crowd made every word louder. By the time Musa finished, the hall was still. No one moved, no one spoke. And then slowly hands came together again, clapping not just for Kareem but for Musa himself. This time the applause was even stronger. People rose to their feet once more. Some shouted words of praise, others lifted their hands in respect, and Musa felt his chest heavy with emotion. He had never been seen this way before, never been heard this way before, and now in the grandest hall he had been lifted into the light. Kareem placed a hand on Musa's shoulder. His eyes filled with pride, and in that simple gesture the lesson of the night was sealed. The wealthy had learned humility. The invisible had been made visible, and the hall that had once ignored Musa now honored him. Yet beneath the clapping and the smiles there was something more, a quiet question that touched every heart. What would come next? What path would this moment open? What role would Musa now play in the days to come? The event slowly came to an end. Guests began to leave, yet they left differently than they had arrived. no longer filled with pride but with thought, no longer careless but reflective. Conversations outside the hall echoed with Musa's words, and the story began to spread quickly. The janitor who spoke in Arabic, the janitor who silenced a hall, the janitor who sat beside the Tycoon. The story would travel far beyond the walls of the hotel, and Musa himself felt the weight of destiny pressing upon him. That night when the hall was empty and the lights grew dim, Musa returned to his work. He picked up his mop once more. He walked across the marble floor, but his steps felt different. His heart was lighter, his spirit higher, and though he moved like a worker, inside he carried the knowledge that he was more than what the world had seen, and somewhere in his heart he knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The stage had been set, and the journey ahead would be greater than anything he had imagined. The night after the great gathering ended, Musa could not sleep. He lay in his small room at the back of the hotel, listening to the hum of the city outside. Every sound felt louder than usual. His mind replayed the moment when he had walked forward, when he had spoken in Arabic, when the hall had fallen silent, and when Karim himself had smiled at him with respect. It all seemed like a dream, yet Musa knew it had been real, and he felt that his life had quietly changed forever. Meanwhile, in the higher rooms of the hotel, Karim also sat awake, his thoughts steady and calm. He thought of the faces in the hall, the way they had looked at Musa, the way pride had melted from their eyes, and he thought of the lesson that had taken root in their hearts. Karim believed deeply that every person has value, and he had always known that sometimes the greatest wisdom rests in the most humble souls. Now he had seen it again with his own eyes, and he knew that Musa's role was far from finished. The next morning, the story had already begun to spread. Guests who had attended the event shared it with others. Reporters wrote quickly. Their words carried through papers and screens. People across the city began to whisper about the janitor who spoke like a scholar. Some doubted it, some were amazed, and some grew curious. The hotel phone rang with questions, messages poured in, and by the afternoon Musa's name had reached beyond the walls of the hotel. At first Musa felt shy about it. When fellow workers looked at him with surprise, he lowered his gaze. When strangers asked if he was the man from the story, he only nodded softly. He still carried himself humbly, still cleaned the floors, still worked with quiet hands. Yet inside he felt a weight growing, a sense that people expected something from him, something more than mopping floors. And though he did not yet know what that was, he could feel destiny calling his name. Karim returned to the hotel 2 days later. His presence once again drew attention. But this time the whispers were different. People spoke not only of the Tycoon but of the janitor. And when Karim saw Musa, he greeted him not as a worker but as a brother. The crowd watching was shocked. The Tycoon who commanded nations placing his hand on the shoulder of a janitor. Yet Karim cared nothing for their surprise, for he saw clearly the value in Musa. That evening, Karim invited Musa to join him for a private dinner. Musa hesitated, unsure if he belonged at such a table. But Karim insisted. They sat together, and Karim spoke to Musa not with the tone of a master, but with the warmth of a friend. He asked about Musa's life, his family, his journey, and Musa told him of his struggles, of how he had worked since youth, of how he had lost chances for study, and how life had pushed him into corners where no one saw his worth. As Musa spoke, Karim listened deeply, nodding with respect, never interrupting, for he knew that true power comes from hearing the voices that the world ignores. After their meal, Karim told Musa that he wished to see him not as a janitor, but as a guide. He explained that the world needed voices like his, voices that remind people of humility and dignity. Karim spoke of events and gatherings where leaders meet, where decisions are made, and he said that Musa should be there, not as a servant but as a speaker. Musa was stunned. His hands trembled, his eyes wide with disbelief. Yet Karim's gaze was steady, his words sure, and Musa felt that perhaps this was not a dream but a path opening before him. The next days passed quickly. Reporters came to the hotel hoping to speak with Musa. Guests who had ignored him before now asked for his time. Workers who once saw him only as a colleague now looked at him with pride. Musa remained humble, still doing his tasks. Yet inside he prepared himself, for Karim had invited him to attend another event, larger than the first, with leaders from different lands. Musa agreed, though his heart raced with both fear and hope. When the day arrived, the hall was even grander than before. More people filled the seats, cameras lined the walls. The air buzzed with expectation. Karim entered with the same calm strength. But now beside him walked Musa, no longer hidden in the shadows, but walking openly before all eyes, dressed in a simple, clean suit that Kareem had arranged for him. His step steady, his heart beating like a drum. The crowd whispered in surprise, for they had not expected to see him again. Kareem spoke first as before, his words rolling in Arabic, confident and proud. The crowd shifted nervously, but this time Musa stepped forward without hesitation. His voice rose, clear and calm, carrying Kareem's message to the hall. He translated with grace, he added light to the meaning, and the audience listened, their eyes fixed not on their pride but on the truth that came through his words. Once again the hall was silenced, but this silence was no longer from ignorance. It was from respect. As Musa spoke, Kareem watched with satisfaction. The plan had worked again, but even more than a plan, it felt like destiny. He had always believed that greatness can come from unexpected places, and now Musa was proving it before the world. Leaders who had once looked only at wealth now saw wisdom in a man of humble beginnings. They felt their own pride shaken, and some even wondered quietly if they too had overlooked voices in their own lands. By the end of the event, Musa was no longer just a janitor in their eyes. He was a messenger, a bridge between hearts, a reminder that dignity has no rank. And when the applause came, it was stronger than before, the sound rising like a storm through the hall. People stood with tears, with smiles. With hands lifted in respect, Musa lowered his head humbly, but his heart felt the weight of the moment. He was no longer hidden, no longer unseen. His journey had begun in truth. That night after the event ended, Kareem spoke to Musa once more. He told him that this was only the start, that he must prepare for more gatherings, for more voices that needed to hear him. Musa felt nervous yet honored, and deep inside he began to believe that perhaps his life had been shaped for this very purpose. All the years of silence, all the years of invisibility, had prepared him to rise at the right time, like a seed hidden under soil waiting for the rain as days turned into weeks. The story spread further. People in other cities spoke of the janitor who had silenced the hall. Invitations began to arrive. Leaders wanted to meet him. Scholars wanted to hear him. And Musa felt the pull of a journey that was greater than anything he had known. He still worked at the hotel, still held the mop in his hands. But now the mop was no longer a symbol of invisibility. It was a reminder of where he had come from, of the humility that shaped his heart, and he promised himself never to forget it. The hotel staff watched with pride. They whispered among themselves that one of their own had risen to honor. Guests who returned asked about him. Some even waited to hear his words again. Musa remained the same in spirit, soft-spoken, respectful, never arrogant, but inside he felt stronger, like a man who had finally found his voice after years of silence. And Kareem stood beside him as a guide, watching the humble janitor step slowly into the light of destiny. But Kareem knew as well that with respect comes responsibility. He knew that the path ahead would not always be easy, that some would doubt Musa, some would envy him, some would resist the lesson of humility. And so Kareem warned him gently, telling him to remain steady, to keep his heart pure, to never let pride steal the gift of wisdom. Musa listened carefully, nodding with gratitude, promising to remain true to himself, for he knew that his strength was not in wealth or position, but in truth. The night grew quiet again as Musa returned to his room. He sat by the window looking out at the city lights, his heart heavy yet full. He thought of his parents, of the language they had given him, of the prayers whispered in the dark, of the long years of silence, and he felt tears rise in his eyes, not tears of sorrow but of gratitude. For he now understood that every moment of his past had shaped him for this journey, and that the road ahead, though unknown, was waiting for him with open arms. The weeks turned into months, and the story of Musa the janitor spread far beyond the hotel walls. It traveled across the city, then across the country, until people in distant lands heard about the man who spoke with wisdom, the man who understood Kareem, the man who silenced a hall full of leaders. Some called it a miracle, others called it a lesson, but all agreed it was something unforgettable. Musa's life changed slowly but surely. Invitations continued to arrive. Some came from schools that wanted him to speak to students, some from leaders who wanted him to attend meetings, and some from communities who wished to hear him tell his story. At first Musa hesitated. He was still the same humble man who carried his mop and bucket, but Kareem reminded him that his voice was a gift not to be hidden but to be shared. And so Musa accepted each time he stood before people. Musa spoke with the same calm tone. He never shouted. He never acted proud. He simply told the truth. He spoke of dignity, of patience, of respect. He spoke of how greatness is not in wealth but in the heart. He spoke of how humility can open doors that pride will close. And every time he spoke, the people listened. They listened because they could feel the honesty in his words, and they left with lighter hearts and deeper thoughts. Karim stayed by his side as a mentor and a brother. He guided Musa through gatherings that were larger and more complex. He reminded him to stay steady, to hold his heart pure, and to remember the life he came from. Musa never forgot. Every time he lifted a microphone, he thought of the mop he once carried. He thought of the empty hallways he had cleaned alone. And those memories kept him grounded. They kept him humble even as the world began to see him as more. The hotel where it all began also changed. No longer was Musa seen as just another worker. He became a symbol for the entire staff, a reminder that every person matters. Guests who entered the hotel often asked about him. They pointed to the corners of the hall and whispered that this was the place where the janitor had walked forward. Workers carried themselves with new pride, for they knew that even in humble clothes there could be greatness waiting to shine. As time passed, Musa's presence grew, but with it came challenges. Some people doubted him. They said he was only a janitor and should not stand among leaders. Some said his wisdom was simple and not fit for great decisions. Musa listened to these voices quietly. He did not argue. He did not fight. He only kept speaking with honesty, and slowly even the doubters found themselves touched by his words. For truth spoken with humility has a power that no argument can defeat. One evening, Karim invited Musa to travel with him to another country. The gathering was said to be the largest yet. Leaders from many lands would attend. People of great influence would sit together, and Karim told Musa that his voice was needed there. Musa agreed, though his heart raced. He felt nervous yet calm, for he had learned that fear does not mean weakness. It only means the moment is important. The journey was long, but when they arrived, Musa was astonished. The hall was vast, larger than any he had ever seen. Lights glowed from the ceiling. Banners hung on the walls, cameras lined the edges. Thousands of eyes waited for the event to begin. Musa stood quietly beside Karim, his hands folded, his breath steady. He looked at the crowd, and for a moment he remembered the first night, the silence, the fear, the step he had taken, and he knew that tonight was the continuation of that step. Karim walked to the stage as he had done before, his robe flowing, his presence calm yet commanding. He spoke again in Arabic, his voice strong, steady, filled with wisdom. And as expected, many in the hall could not understand. But before restlessness could spread, Musa rose from his seat. He walked forward with calm steps, and the hall fell silent. All eyes turned to him. Cameras pointed, whispers filled the air. For many had heard of him, but few had seen him in person. Musa began to translate Karim's words. His voice carried across the vast hall, clear and gentle. He spoke slowly so that every listener could follow. He explained the wisdom with care. He added images and meaning, and the audience listened with deep attention. As his words flowed, the silence grew heavy again. But this time it was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of hearts being touched, a silence of respect. Halfway through, Musa paused. He looked at the crowd, and Karim nodded to him as if giving permission. Musa then began to share his own words. He spoke of his life, of how he had once been invisible, of how he had learned that humility can be a greater strength than pride. He told them that wisdom can come from any place, from any person, that no one should be overlooked, and his voice trembled not with fear but with emotion, for he was speaking from the deepest part of his soul. The audience leaned forward. Leaders who were used to commanding others sat still like students. Reporters who usually chased stories sat quietly, and even the guards by the doors turned their heads to listen. The hall that had been filled with noise at the start now carried only his voice, his words floating like light across every heart. And when he finished, the silence was deep, so deep that one could hear the breath of the person sitting nearby. Then the applause began, soft at first, then stronger, until it roared like thunder across the hall. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some with tears in their eyes, some lifting their hands in respect. Musa lowered his head humbly. He did not smile with pride. He simply stood quietly, yet inside his heart felt full, not with fame but with gratitude. Gratitude that his voice had found its purpose. After the gathering, many leaders came to him. They asked for his thoughts, they thanked him. They shook his hand with respect, and Musa answered each one softly, never raising himself above them, always speaking with humility. And Karim stood nearby watching with quiet joy, for he knew that the lesson of the first night had now spread far beyond one hall. It had reached across lands, it had touched powerful hearts, and it would continue to grow. In the days that followed, Musa's story spread even further, but he never forgot who he was. He still visited the hotel. He still spoke with the workers. He still carried himself with the same calm spirit, for he knew that his strength was not in being seen as great, but in remaining true. He understood that the world may see him as special, but in his own eyes he was simply a man with a gift to remind others of humility and dignity. Kareem one evening said to him, "Musa, you were once a janitor who cleaned floors, but now you are a man who cleans hearts." Musa smiled softly at the words, for he knew they carried truth. He had once wiped dust from tiles. Now his words wiped dust from prideful souls. And in both acts there was dignity, for no work was small when done with honesty. The seasons changed. Years began to pass, but the memory of that first night never faded. Musa often returned to that hall in his thoughts. He remembered the silence, the fear, the step he had taken, and he realized that one moment of courage can change the course of a life. One step can open a path to destiny, and he hoped that others would see his story not as his alone, but as a lesson for themselves, that they too could rise from silence into voice. And so Musa's journey became a story told again and again, a story of a janitor and a tycoon, a story of humility and wisdom, a story of silence and voice. It was told in homes, in schools, in gatherings, and in halls across lands, and every time it was told, people remembered that greatness can come from anywhere, that respect belongs to every soul, and that true power lies not in wealth but in truth. On quiet nights, Musa still walked through the hotel with his mop, though now he did not need to. He chose to, for it reminded him of where he had come from. It reminded him that no matter how far he went, humility was his foundation, and as he worked he whispered prayers of gratitude, thanking the one who had given him voice, thanking the path that had lifted him, and thanking the moment that had changed his life forever.